Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Monk School Queen's International Institute on Social Policy for 2022. I'm Naomi Alboim, and I'm a distinguished fellow at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University, and also the Senior Policy Fellow at the Canada Excellence Research Chair Program in Migration and Integration at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm also a member of the small but mighty organizing committee for this institute. To begin, as part of our efforts on recognition and reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and learn on these lands and recognize our obligation to care for the land that we all share. For over 25 years, the International Institute has brought together researchers, policymakers, community leaders, and service providers to discuss the most pressing social policy challenges facing Canada and other OECD countries. This year, Queen's University and the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy have joined forces to host an ambitious program focused on whether and how we need to reform or even transform Canadian social policy for a more resilient and successful future. The 2022 Institute launched on October 31st, a day-long conference at the Monk School on the meta challenges and policy choices facing Canada and other OECD countries, socioeconomic, cultural, generational, and political. Today's session is on immigration and is the third in a series of 9 virtual policy seminars drilling down into major areas of social policy that are most in flux and ripe for rethinking. Last week, we focused on the labor market and on income protection. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, Marion Campbell-Jarvis. Marion is currently the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategic and Program Policy at Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, where she oversees a number of economic immigration programs, leads program policy on refugee resettlement and asylum, and provides strategic policy advice including on related international and intergovernmental issues. Prior to this role, Marion served as Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet for Social Development Policy at the Privy Council Office and has played a number of senior roles at the then Human Resources and Social Development Canada and Health Canada. Marion, I'm very proud to say, holds a master's degree in public administration from Queen's University. Marion, over to you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I'm delighted to moderate the panel this afternoon. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, colleagues. I am joining the panel today from Ottawa, which is the land and territorial base of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. This session is really timely. Just last week, Minister Fraser, Canada's Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, tabled the 2023-2025 Immigration Levels Plan in Parliament with an ambitious growth to 500,000 permanent residents in 2025. This plan emphasizes economic immigration, particularly regional economic immigration, and supports family reunification and meeting Canada's humanitarian commitments. Both temporary and permanent residents make important contributions to Canada, including Canada's labour market needs, and Canada's economy does need a wide range of skills across a number of different sectors. Given that immigration is the main fuel for the labour market, and given the current labour market shortages, and thinking about Canada's future economic trajectory, this session is particularly relevant on the heels of the pandemic and recovery. There are all sorts of really interesting policy questions about the labour market immigration nexus, and how to best integrate workers at all skill levels. I am delighted to moderate the session today. Look forward to seeing questions coming through. And I'm really pleased to introduce our two panelists here with us, very thoughtful scholars, to share with us they are doing to inform an evidence-based discourse. First, I welcome Martin Woos, who is Professor of Migration Studies and the Deputy Director of the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute in Florence. He is on leave from the University of Oxford, where he is Professor of Political Economy. Martin's research focuses on the economics and politics of international migration with a strong comparative dimension. Our second panelist is Rupa Banerjee, and Rupa is the Canada Research Chair in Economic Inclusion, Employment and Entrepreneurship of Canada's Immigrants, and Associate Professor of Human Resource Management and Organizational Behavior at Toronto Metropolitan University. Her primary research interest lies in the employment outcomes of new immigrants, both temporary and high-skilled permanent residents to Canada. She is particularly interested in integration issues and the institutional barriers to that integration. I will turn first to Martin to set the stage with an international perspective on how migrants are helping to meet labor market needs. Martin, over to you and welcome.
Hello and good afternoon. First of all, I'm very happy to be here, and I'd like to thank Naomi and the other organizers for inviting me to join this event on immigration. As Marian mentioned, I've been asked to reflect a little bit on international experience, international perspectives on linking immigration to labor shortages and skills needs. And I thought what I would do is, rather than give a kind of a selective view of a few specific countries, I'd like to reflect in the 20 minutes that I have on what I think are some of the fundamental challenges and policy questions in policymaking on labor immigration. And I'd also like to add a couple of new questions that have arisen in particular because of COVID-19. Could I have the next slide, please? So here it's a brief overview. Here are the 6 issues that I'd like to talk about. The first one relates to the goals of policymaking, the second one to the protection of local workers, the third to problems with measuring skills and shortages, the fourth, the debate about alternative responses to shortages. I'll touch briefly on the debate between temporary and permanent immigration, and toward the end, I'd like to say something about what COVID and a concern with resilience might mean for policymaking. Next slide, please. So probably one of the most basic questions when we think about labor immigration policy is simply what should be the goals of policymaking? And I should say that by labor immigration policy, I'm thinking about policies that regulate fundamentally 3 things: the numbers or the scale of immigration, the selection of migrants, for example, the skill level or even the nationalities, and then the rights that migrants receive after admission. So I think the rights component is obviously critical, and why it's so important in my view to link debates about immigration to debates about social policy and inclusion. So it's about regulating admission, numbers and selection, and then rights. And there's a list of potential objectives that will of course be very familiar. Most countries, when they regulate immigration, are thinking about economic growth. How do you make migrants benefit the economy? Distribution generally is a concern. That means how do we protect certain groups among domestic workers? Social effects typically feature as well. So these are all host country effects. Now COVID, and I'll say a little bit about that later, obviously introduced a concern about the resilience of essential services during an external shock. And I think what COVID has shone a light on the role that migrants play in as workers in many of these essential services. So I suppose there's a fundamental question that arises whether and how resilience of the society, of the economy, should be an explicit additional objective of policymaking, and what might that mean? The other quick point I want to make is also a very obvious one, but in my view, again, is often at the heart of these debates. To what extent should the benefits and the costs and benefits of migration for migrants and countries of origin be actually objectives of receiving countries, of host countries? Most countries around the world don't actually pay a lot of attention to the impacts of immigration on migrants and host countries when they design their immigration policies. But how you evaluate migration critically depends, obviously, on the extent to which you might want to include some of those objectives. And that raises questions for representation and governance. We often hear about migrants creating triple wins or triple benefits, but whether when migration is beneficial or not for a particular group, I think, can only really be decided if you involve actors from those groups in decision making, because migration involves trade-offs, costs and benefits. So it's only the people themselves, I think, that can decide. So countries themselves that can decide whether or not a particular policy is beneficial or not. So I think that's I think a first fundamental question that is worth reflecting on briefly and discussing. Could I have the next slide, please? A second core question is, to what extent immigration policy should protect domestic workers from competition, essentially? One way of thinking about this is whether or not there should be a right to preferential access for citizens or for residents to new jobs or to jobs in a particular country. So when a new job comes up, should citizens and local workers have a preferential right to apply for this job, or should employers be able to basically search the global labor market immediately? And in some countries, many countries obviously try to protect domestic workers, but in some countries, for example, in the UK, in the past, certain high-paying jobs were excluded from resident labor market tests. So the idea there was no protection, that in certain high-paying jobs, employers would go to global labor market immediately, whereas in other jobs, there was a policy imperative to encourage employers to look in the domestic market first. In a way, I think there are two tensions. Governments want to be friendly to business. They want to encourage economic growth. So on the one hand, there's an imperative to globalizing labor markets. At the same time, there's an imperative often to protect local workers. And I think there can be a clear tension between these two issues. And who exactly should be protected is an important question, as is, of course, the question how this can be best done in practice. And this is an expert audience, so you will all recognize these different policies that I'm sure Canada is using as well to some extent. Resident labor market tests, shortage occupation lists, different types of labor market regulations, quotas, or even taxes. Singapore uses a taxation system. Basically, in Singapore, employers need to pay a special tax for every foreign worker they employ as part of an incentive to not to overuse migrant workers. Can we have the next slide, please? I'll say a little bit about shortage occupation lists later, but this is just an example from the UK. So this is a list of jobs where the government believes that there are shortages and where immigration should be facilitated. And how to compile this list is typically very, very contested. And for 7 years, during 2007, 2014, I was a member of the UK's Migration Advisory Committee that was tasked to draw up these kinds of lists. And in what follows, I just want to reflect briefly on some of the difficulties with doing that. Next slide, please. So if you want to link immigration, if you want to have a policy that regulates immigration in a way that the admission of migrants responds to skills needs and labor shortages, there are a number of fundamental questions. The first question is, actually the term skill is quite ambiguous. It's conceptually and empirically ambiguous. And it's very hard to know how you can measure skills. Some skills are credentialized, so there's certificates. Others are non-credentialized. Experience can be exceptionally important in some occupations. There's hard skills and soft skills. Soft skills, for example, team working skills, customer handling skills that some employers particularly value. Now, when employers talk about a demand for migrant workers, they often talk about a demand for employees with specific personal characteristics and attitudes You'll hear talk about the good work ethic, cooperative workers. So I think there's actually quite a thin line between a demand for migrant workers, for skills, and a demand for a compliant workforce, and the way policy needs to figure out what is it exactly that employers are asking for, and what is acceptable in a way, and what are good or bad reasons for demanding migrant workers. And a similar issue arises, I think, with shortages. There is no universal definition of a shortage. A basic textbook economics model suggests if there's a shortage, wages should rise, and the shortage should be reduced. Now, of course, reality does not quite work how a basic textbook model works. There are often reasons why wages cannot rise. But I think there's a fundamental point here, which is simply, again, an obvious point, is that any shortage is partly a function of employment conditions and wages. So when we talk about shortages and skills needs, I think we do need to talk about the conditions of employment and the role that wages might play in clearing those shortages. Now, when employers talk about shortages, in my experience, they often talk about the demand for more workers at prevailing wages, so at current wages, and not at higher wages. And of course, there's also evidence that in some sectors, some employers can develop a preference for certain types of migrant workers. And again, in Canada, there's been quite a bit of research on this. Some employers might have variable hiring queues where they have a perceived hierarchy of nationalities of workers who are most suited to the jobs that are that need to be filled. One reason, for example, why some employers prefer migrant workers is precisely because of their immigration status. Temporary work permit schemes often tie workers to particular employers. And some of the employers that I've spoken to in Europe particularly appreciate that because it's essentially a tied workforce. So again, I think one needs to reflect on whether or not, what that means, that kind of consideration means for whether or not it's a good or bad idea to use immigration to respond to particular employer demands for migrant workers. Next slide, please. And once we have discussed skills and shortages, of course, the next very difficult debate is how to respond to the shortage. And the basic point I want to make here is that immigration is often a sensible response, but it's not always the only response available. So in principle, I've listed a range of responses that might be available to employers: raising wages to attract more domestic workers, automation to reduce labor intensity, relocate to other countries, stop producing labor-intensive products, services, or employ more migrant workers. Now, obviously, not all these options will be available to all employers, and it might not be possible or desirable to implement some of these options. Care services or health services, obviously, most of them need to be provided in country. But again, the point I'm trying to make is that immigration is not always the only option available, and which of these options is the most desirable in a way is also a normative question. Whose interests are we trying to serve? So the bigger picture point here is, I think, that employers don't make their decisions in an institutional vacuum. So which of these options employers will pick will be heavily influenced by the institutional framework and by wider public policies. So, for example, whether or not employers have a demand for particular types of migrant workers depends obviously on the presence and quality of the domestic education and training system. If you have a training system that doesn't produce good workers with the right skills, then there will be a demand for migrant workers. It might also be influenced by welfare policies. It might be influenced by housing policies. If there's no housing available in areas with high labor demand, again, that might have an impact on what options employers go for. The sector-specific policies could have a huge impact on employer demand for migrant workers. So again, an example from the UK that I'm familiar with: a large share of the care workforce in the UK is made up of migrant workers. And one big reason for that is simply the particular way in which social care in the UK is organized. In the UK, social care is publicly funded, but mainly privately provided because it's outsourced. And there's a structural, because of long-term underinvestment in the care sector, there's a structural dependence on low-cost labor in that sector. And as a consequence, you often have migrants doing these jobs, particularly in cities with high living costs. So the high reliance on migrant workers is a direct consequence of a government policy not to invest in social care over a long period of time. So these system effects, I think, are really important, these wider effects. Labor market policies, welfare policies, housing policies, all have an impact on how employers decide and what kinds of workers they demand. Next slide, please. One of the final enduring questions I think that I want to briefly touch upon is the question of temporary or permanent labor immigration programs. Now, when you look actually at labor immigration policies in high income countries around the world, the vast majority of them are temporary migration programs. So by temporary, I mean programs that provide temporary residence permits and work permits upon arrival. Some of these programs allow workers to upgrade to permanence after some time, not all of them. So the points-based systems for highly skilled workers that grant permanent residence of arrival upon arrival that Australia and Canada and New Zealand has been running, I mean, those have been quite exceptional. And as you all know, their relative importance is declining. So really, mostly when I teach on labor immigration policy, I usually say that we're mainly talking about temporary labor immigration programs. And temporary labor immigration programs are controversial. One of the reasons they're controversial is because they restrict the rights of migrant workers in various different ways. The chart here on the left shows you the rights restrictions of high-skilled labor immigration programs in democracies, low-skilled labor immigration programs in democracies, and of low-skilled labor immigration programs in authoritarian regimes. And the closer the dot to the zero line, the greater the restriction. So unsurprisingly, what this shows you is the kind of outer black line, the least rights restrictions are implemented when it comes to high-skilled labor immigration programs in democracies, followed by low-skilled labor immigration programs in democracies, and countries like the Gulf states are the most restrictive. And so these programs routinely restrict access to social rights, family reunification rights, but also to some civil and political rights, the right to vote, and also to some economic rights, most notably the right to free choice of employment. So I think one way of thinking about this is that, I mean, it's also an ethical question, of course, whether or not we should be advocating for such programs. But I think one way of looking about this is to recognize that these temporary migration programs really involve, I think, a key ethical dilemma between global justice and domestic justice. So that means from a global justice point of view, liberalizing labor immigration to high-income countries is a good thing because it gives workers in low-income countries the chance to radically increase their earnings and generate remittances and help their families, so thereby reduce global inequalities. But at the same time, the other horn of the dilemma is that if you restrict migrants' rights, this, of course, goes against the equality standard in liberal democratic high-income countries. So I think a lot of people have written about this, and there's papers written about what rights restrictions are acceptable or not, and I've contributed to that literature. But a recent paper that I've done with Rainer Baubeck, basically we argue that one way of resolving this issue is not by specifying which rights should be restricted from a normative point of view, but through fair representation. And that simply means that by getting the actors who are affected by all this involved in policy design. So sending countries represented, getting host countries represented, and, which is the most difficult aspect of it, getting migrants somehow represented in the policy design of multilateral temporary migration programs. And we can discuss that perhaps a bit later. Last slide, please. So I'd like to end by just spending 1 minute on this issue of systemic resilience. And the question I simply want to raise is, what might this mean for policymaking on labor immigration programs? So during COVID-19, it became quite clear that suddenly everybody was very concerned about, for obvious reasons, to keep food production systems, transport systems, social care and healthcare going. And we saw that many migrants were employed in those sectors. So the question is, might that kind of concern have meaningful consequences for the design of labor immigration policies? And I think the answer could be yes, but I think we need to also research about how migrants might then affect that resilience. But I think three types of changes in policy debates would have to happen. First one, I think we'll have to start thinking about transnational systems of production rather than national systems. So migrants contribute to resilience not only by working in Canada, by working in Europe, in high-income countries, but also by working in global supply chains. North America and Europe, we import a lot of medical equipment. For example, from Malaysia, we import a lot of rubber gloves, medical gloves, that are being produced in Malaysia using migrant workers from, example, Nepal. So migrants are working in the supply chain to help sustain resilience in high-income countries. So I think we need to think much more broadly. Obviously, we'd have to start thinking from short-term to long-term. So resilience is a longer-term issue, not just a short-term economic efficiency distribution issue. And the third change that would have to happen, I think there would have to be a shift in priority from protecting employment of citizens through all kinds of policy making within immigration policy to protecting the resilience of essential services. So again, a bit of a change in the mindset, which politically might be challenging, but if you believe in resilience, I think it would be necessary. I leave it here. So a set of kind of basic questions, and I hope they will help stimulate some questions and debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was a really terrific overview of some of the big picture. Very helpful to unpack issues around resilience of domestic workers, of essential services, and of course of the migrants themselves. I also really noted that at the outset, we framed this as the nexus of immigration and labor market. And I think you very rightly pointed out the broader interaction of a range of other areas, whether childcare, etc., in influencing employer decisions. And I note that some of those other areas of policy are really the subject of this conference and other sessions. So really great to kind of bring together that intersectionality. Thank you. I'd now like to turn to Rupa to go from that kind of broad context and a deeper dive into the Canadian context. So Rupa, over to you.
Thanks so much, Marion. I'm just going to share my slides. You see my slides okay? Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much. Thanks, Naomi. Thanks to all of the organizers for inviting me. This is certainly an extremely important and extremely timely conversation that we're having right now on the future of immigration policy in particular, and the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in Canada, given the numerous updates and policy changes and announcements that have been made lately. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Canadian context. And so in the audience, I'm sure there are, experts on this. And so, I'm kind of going to set the stage a little bit and maybe bring up some of the enduring issues and dilemmas that we've been facing, but also talk about some of the more pressing new concerns that have come up recently. Okay, so this is not a surprise. This chart is very well known to all of us now. Recently, we've been told the new immigration targets from 2023 to 2025. But this just kind of, to me, really illustrates the magnitude of increase that IRCC plans to implement in terms of immigrant admissions. So up to 2022, those are actual numbers. And then, of course, going forward, those are the projected numbers. And so we can really see that, since the pandemic, we've had this massive jump of planned immigration numbers. And this is really in contrast to a lot of other immigrant receiving countries who have pulled back, actually, who stopped immigration during the pandemic, essentially, and really curtailed the numbers, except for perhaps essential temporary migrant workers. So we have kind of, in Canada, done quite the opposite. We only stopped immigration or really curtailed immigration for a very short period of time, and very quickly picked right back up and started to increase our numbers to larger than ever before, to larger than before the pandemic. So this is a very unique way of handling the post-pandemic recovery And the Canadian government has basically very clearly signaled that we are going to be relying on newcomers to foster growth and foster prosperity, rather than some of the other options that Martin actually mentioned as well, that are out there for dealing with labor shortages. Our government has really clearly said that we're going to be using newcomers, we're going to be using immigration as a way to deal with our labor shortages in Canada. Now, when we look at the projected streams for economic immigrants for the next 2 years going forward, what we really find is that the provincial programs, provincial nominee programs are expected to really increase. So already we've seen that provincial nominee programs have really started to kind of take over in terms of the main avenue for becoming PR. We hadn't quite had it reach majority numbers yet, but it looks like by 2025, provincial nominees will be, among the largest, most numerous group of immigrants coming in. That says a lot, right? So we know that Canadian Experience Class and provincial nominees, of course, are the sort of two-step migrants that we've really been pushing towards over the past decade or two. And with the increase in provincial nominees and the increased role of provinces that clearly is going to take place over the next couple of years, that kind of really changes the model of immigration that we have from a really federal, a national model, and a one-step model, which was focused on economic needs, yes, but also really on long-term nation building kind of goals, to much more regional, much more, immediate labor market kinds of concerns, perhaps. It's also interesting to note that some of the other programs, the pilots that have been running since the pandemic, the numbers are not, they're expected to rise somewhat, but not much. So, these pilots really do stay quite small over the next few years. Okay, so within this context of increasing, absolutely, significantly increasing numbers of immigrants, the problem of immigrant labor market disparity is still there, right? So we haven't solved the problem, clearly. We have certainly seen that the move towards two-step migration has improved outcomes, but significant differences remain between skilled immigrants and Canadian-born counterparts. So there have been some, recent publications by colleagues at Statistics Canada that have shown that the gap in employment rates have been increasing. So in that sense, we can say that immigrant talent has been helping to deal with labor shortages, perhaps, or filling labor gaps. But on the other hand, when you look at earnings, the gap in earnings got worse in the 80s and 90s between Canadian-born and immigrant workers, and then kind of got worse between 2000 and 2015. Between 2015 and 2019, which is kind of the most recent information that we have, we've seen some slight improvements. So this is really the time when perhaps we're seeing the beneficial impact of two-step immigration on immigrant earnings. But that being said, the problem of immigrant earnings disparity is still, a significant issue in the labor market. With the pandemic, there was a lot of talk and questions about whether this exacerbated newcomers' labor market disparities. And I've done some research with some colleagues that have found that, in fact, relative earnings haven't necessarily gotten worse over the pandemic, but they haven't really changed. So they continue to earn, significantly less than Canadian-born counterparts. And this is very much related to underemployment, particularly because we have an increasingly highly educated immigrant population. And so underemployment, continues to be a major concern. And up until about at least 2016, which is the last data I've seen, based on a Statistics Canada report, underemployment's actually been kind of getting worse. So just because immigrants are getting jobs, their employment rates are improving, doesn't mean they're getting jobs in their fields, right? So they're still experiencing significant downgrading and de-skilling. So the move towards two-step immigration and the streams that really focus on two-step immigration has kind of been touted as being our remedy for the disparities in the labor market. So I recently did an analysis where we actually looked at the earnings gap of immigrants in different streams, and also looked at it across the earnings distribution to see whether people who are coming through the two-step streams, so provincial nominee programs and Canadian experience class, really do face much less of an earnings gap. And what we found is that, yes, there is less of an earnings gap in those, in particularly in the Canadian experience class, but there is still an earnings gap, right? Even once you look at the different points in the earnings distribution, I think a really important observation from our results is that really at the highest levels of earnings, you see the largest earnings gaps in all streams. So to me, this kind of follows in with the age-old story that employers in Canada seem to love migration, particularly temporary migration. But when it comes to hiring immigrants into high-skill, high-wage jobs, they're not as interested in hiring immigrants, and particularly in hiring them at the prevailing or appropriate wages. So to me, the results of this analysis, and this is using the 2016 census, of course, so it's a bit dated now, but to me, this story still says that, look, our step towards two-step migration is helpful, perhaps in improving wages, but it doesn't necessarily fix our problem of underemployment and skill devaluation. So, we've really been moving towards the benefits of express entry. And in Canada, since 2015, we've been using this hybrid model of immigrant selection, which really tries to combine both merit or human capital-based elements with demand-driven elements. And the way that our demand-driven immigration has been working is that because so much emphasis is put on two-step migration, employers and post-secondary institutions really are acting as gatekeepers to determine who actually gets enough points to get in through the express entry point system. So there's been a really kind of crucial question that's come up, which is that, has this hybrid model really helped us to deal with the challenges that we've faced, particularly after COVID-19? And so recently, some colleagues and I have been kind of looking at this question. Of course, express entry starts, with an expression of interest, and so it is really seen as a best in line kind of way of admitting immigrants rather than a first in line supply driven way. So the question becomes, does this really help? What we find is that there are a lot of elements within express entry that perhaps might contribute to addressing the disadvantages that newcomers face. So there is, as I said, more emphasis than ever before on pre-landing work experience, and pre-landing work experience, of course, in higher level or higher skilled occupational groups. And the assumption there is that if newcomers can have pre-landing Canadian work experience in high-skilled occupations, then they won't face this problem of no Canadian experience, right? Which has been kind of the major narrative of why immigrants are not able to get into their fields, is the lack of Canadian experience. So the emphasis on high-skilled pre-landing work experience should absolutely address that issue. Moreover, there are extra points for post-secondary education completed in Canada. There have been an ECA, an educational credential assessment requirement added in for those who have foreign education. There's mandatory language testing that's been added, and there's been a real preference for young applicants. So, anecdotally, I've heard folks say that if you're over the age of 30, you can forget about it. You're not going to get into Canada. So through economic streams anyways. So, the question becomes, has this mix of system in express entry really done its job? Has it really fixed the issues? What we know so far is that this emphasis on pre-landing experience does seem to help, right? But there have been arguments on the other side that question, at what cost? So the cost of actually working as a temporary resident, has to be borne by the newcomer, by the migrant worker. Those individuals don't get access to settlement services paid by the government. They often now are not tied to a labor market impact assessment. So in that sense, they are free in terms of being able to change occupations. But when you actually speak to people on those work permits, there are still significant barriers in trying to advocate for their labor rights as a temporary resident. The other danger that has really become apparent with not having LMIAs is that we have very little information about what these people are doing. So with labor market tests and jobs that had labor market impact assessments, we had records. We knew what kind of jobs temporary residents were holding, for how long, and what their migration trajectory really was. With the new emphasis on non-LMIA tested kinds of work permits in the International Mobility Program in particular, we have very little data. And so it's kind of a black box in which folks are working presumably to try and get permanent resident status, and some are able to make it through and many are not. So the assumption that the International Mobility Program is for high-skilled folks who have these wonderful and easy routes to permanent resident status is in fact not quite true, right? So there are a lot of challenges and barriers even within that program to becoming PR. We also know that some of the other requirements within Express Entry, like the mandatory ECA requirement or the mandatory language testing, do tend to improve employment and earnings. So it's kind of a mixed story or a nuanced story. On one hand, some of the provisions within Express Entry do seem to improve earnings upon landing. But on the other hand, this doesn't answer the question on whether this is beneficial for kind of the challenges that Canada is going to be facing over the next several years. That actually requires us to look at whether Express Entry is filling the labor market needs of the country. So there are some unintended consequences of Express Entry that have really become apparent. So in a new study that I've just completed with some colleagues, we found that with the introduction of Express Entry, certain kinds of skill sets, certain kinds of occupational groups tend to be overrepresented. And they are structurally favored precisely because of the emphasis on two-step migration. So because temporary resident permits tend to be in particular areas, so things like IT and finance sectors, you see more high-skilled temporary workers in those sectors, they tend to be structurally favored to enter as PR under Express Entry. This doesn't necessarily represent who we need in our labor market today. So a lot of the often regulated sectors, which are often really underrepresented within Express Entry, such as healthcare, skilled trades, and caregiving, are high human resource intensive, so they cannot really be automated out, and often usually require occupational licensing. So you put those two things together, it's unlikely for a lot of temporary residents to be working in these areas, and hence it's unlikely for them to be coming in through Express Entry. This has kind of led to a bit of an occupational homogeneity among Express Entry entrants in Canada today. So when you kind of think about the ways in which those unintended consequences actually, impact our labor market, we have a need for lower skill workers. A recent study by colleagues at Statistics Canada show that perhaps there's an oversupply of high-skilled workers in relation to the actual availability of high-skilled jobs. And in fact, we do need workers across the skills distribution and across the sector distribution as well. And so this oversupply of high-skilled workers and the increasing oversupply in particular sectors like IT and finance disadvantages other immigrants, actually. So newcomers are the ones that suffer most from this oversupply of high-skilled workers coming in. So federal skilled trades program is another one which is, extremely underutilized. In 2019, it was only 2% of invitations to apply were through the federal skilled trades program. In 2020 and 2021, they're listed as 0%, because of course we have really pivoted to allowing only those who are already in the country to transition to permanent resident status through express entry until very recently. So very few skilled trades folks are coming in as two-step migrants. So we have very, very few folks coming in there. And then finally, while we have really tried to tweak express entry and our selection criteria, issues like soft skills, organizational fit, these are things that we can't necessarily measure with our, our types of points that we have. And yet they continue to be significant barriers for newcomers across sectors. So the question really becomes, how much can we do with immigration policy, and how much it should be really under the realm of integration policy, and also the warmth of the welcome or the context of reception, right? So how much has to be done from the employer side, from the Canadian population side, to really try and help and encourage newcomers to integrate into labor markets. So what we found is that we've really put together a lot of temporary solutions to long-term problems. Of course, during COVID-19, there have been a patchwork of pilot programs and temporary initiatives to try and address the labor shortages that have been popping up. We're always about 2 steps behind in terms of the sectors and the jobs that have shortages. Our occupational shortage projections are quite limited. We don't really know what our labor market needs are, very clearly. And so this constantly evolving rules, regulations, and pilots diminishes the efficiency and effectiveness of the system. So what I would propose is that, we need to have more of a systematic approach to include, I'm just going to move to the next slide, to include permanent pathways to permanent residence within express entry for temporary residents who are already in the country, high skill and lower skill. So this means working with, all of the stakeholders, including employers, provinces, post-secondary institutions, to try and, navigate this, this shift. So not only should stakeholders be involved in trying to improve the conditions for temporary residents while they're temporary residents, but also to try and include them in the dialogue on how to help those folks then transition to becoming permanent residents and Canadian citizens. So, for those in regulated professions, the regulatory bodies also must play an important role here. We still see that despite all of the efforts to have fairness within our regulatory occupational regulation systems, a lot of occupational licensing bodies continue to have at least tacit requirements to have Canadian experience, for example, to get licensed. So there's a lot of room for improvement there. I'm going to go back to this previous slide. So, recently IRCC has announced that there's going to be some changes and amendments to express entry, so express entry 2.0, which would invite applicants based on not just the point system, but specifically folks in certain sectors or educational backgrounds or certain language skills. And so it really remains to be seen whether this will be an effective amendment to try and improve the efficiency and the ability of express entry to meet the labor market challenges. The question is, what are the unintended ripple effects of these amendments? We've seen that even just the introduction of express entry and the many tweaks that have been happening since 2015 have had ripple effects that we haven't really expected. So by including more involvement by, other relevant entities, what will that do to our immigrant, our newcomer population, in terms of their characteristics? What will that do to the kinds of skills they will bring? And whose interests will be prioritized? Will they be short-term interests or long-term interests? So these are all questions that really, I think, remain up in the air, and something that we should be very hyper-vigilant about as we try and navigate sort of the next phase of express entry in Canada. So I'm going to leave it there, and I just want to thank everyone for attending, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rupa. That was a really terrific overview as well, and of Canada's programming and streams and some of the issues you've really pulled out. The dynamic of how migration in Canada is changing, with a number of visitors, international students, foreign workers coming to Canada for that temporary experience and then seeking to stay, rather than what we might have thought about a generation ago, people coming to Canada for the first time directly from overseas with that permanent residence in hand. So that two-step migration pattern is a big shift. And then when we overlay that with some of the complexities that you brought out around the labor market and high skills and low skills, so really, really helpful. And I think you've lit up a number of questions coming in from participants, both of you. Maybe I'll turn to some of those questions then, and really engage in some of that dialogue here. Both of you have raised that phenomenon of the temporary and permanent, and perhaps those two aren't quite so watertight compartments any longer. Rupa, you touched a little bit on some of the express entry pieces. And Martin, you spoke about resilience. I'm wondering if we can push that a little bit deeper in terms of, in the Canadian context, what do we need to take into account, given these shifts in migration, in order to ensure that we are positioned to address both immediate, but also those longer term needs?
Sorry, was it to Martin first or myself first?
Martin, why don't we start with you, and then I'll turn to Rupa.
Well, as I said, I think the core question is if there is a political, in a way, commitment to making resilience part of the story when it comes to immigration policy, and if that is the case, I think then I mean there are various ways in which the consideration could be built into immigration policy making. So, for example, again, I'll go back to the case that I'm most familiar with in the UK. It is the case that actually there's a lot of migrants employed in publicly funded and public sector occupations, not only the NHS, but also in, as I said, in care, but also in a lot of other industries in food production. But it was clear to me in the 2000s and early 2000s and late 2000s, when I was involved in policy making, that actually the government's approach was that migrants, in a way, were very much appreciated in those sectors, and essentially they were a subsidy to some of these sectors, because there was a reluctance perhaps to invest. And I remember I suggested at the time that there was a point. The UK at the time had some sort of a points-based system, and why don't you give extra points for being employed in so-called strategic sectors? And of course, everybody's talking about strategic immigration policy, but nobody's quite clear about what strategic means. But if strategic means some sort of industrial policy where you say some sectors are particularly important, and I support these sectors through a proactive immigration policy, then you could attract even migrants into those sectors, and even have particular programs that reward migrants that do these kinds of jobs. So I think the Canadian context is quite different from the one that we have in Europe. But at the time, I can't remember, I think it was under Gordon Brown, I think it was felt that yes, this might be a sensible policy, but politically it was considered unacceptable to basically suggest to the public as well that migrants, there's an active policy in a way of using immigration to support public service delivery in this way. Now, I wonder whether things have changed now, because I know, I mean, one difference between Canada and also European countries is there's a different kind of, I think that public norms and attitudes are more conducive, I think, to certain policies in Canada than in Europe. But the big question in Europe is, have things changed with the pandemic? Is there now a greater recognition of the importance of resilience? And does that mean that even politically, it might become possible to incorporate in policymaking? Sorry, that was a little slightly roundabout way of addressing your question. But I do think fundamentally it starts with whether or not there is a recognition of the issue, of the problem, and I think there is, but whether or not that leads to a political impetus to incorporate it into policymaking.
Thank you, Martin. Rupa, do you like to respond to that too?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the Canadian context is so very different in this particular regard compared to the European context or the American context as well. You know, we somehow have still remained quite positive towards permanent immigration. And in fact, you know, still the public seems to take pride in the fact that we have, you know, multiculturalism, and permanent immigration is a main feature of our you know, culture in Canada, I suppose. I would advocate that the real shift from permanent to temporary and this lack of transparency in transitions between temporary and permanent as well really undermine the future of Canada's perception towards immigration. The feeling that people, you know, the fact that Canadians tend to view immigrants as being, you know, positive for Canada's economy and also for Canada's culture really has to do with the ethos we have built around Canada being an immigrant society. Now, once we shift from a permanent immigration program, which brings immigrants and their families to, you know, build communities and settle and become the next generation of Canadians, I think, you know, there's a real risk that we will shift into a much more negative view of immigration. So I think, you know, there's this kind of paradox or this kind of balancing act between short-term needs of employers and the long-term needs of not just economic long-term needs, but more sort of the nation-building needs of Canada to actually sustain what we have kind of built ourselves up to be, and to try and kind of actually live up to that. And so I have a lot of concern, particularly with the growth of international students and the postgraduate work permits that go along with it, which really fall under the International Mobility Program, which is not labor market tested, and the exploitation of former students, those who graduate from Canadian post-secondary institutions, and what that means for how people view foreigners or non-Canadians. I think that there's you know, a lot of folks, when they just walk in their city and they see temporary international students who are, you know, working in low-skill service jobs, there's a sense that, you know, this is kind of not the image or the ideal of immigration that we had kind of signed up for. So I'm really concerned about the exploitation of international students within that system, the lack of support, the lack of you know, pathways to permanent residence for many international students within that system. So, you know, those are real areas of concern. And so for me, the recent policy announcements of loosening of regulations, say, for example, for work hours of international students, don't really address the fundamental issue of uncapped international student numbers and uncapped postgraduate work permit numbers and capped permanent resident numbers. I think that's a fundamental concern. And, you know, as gatekeepers, post-secondary institutions and employers now have a responsibility in many ways to play a role, not just in bringing in international students, but in setting up the context so that those folks can be successful. So, examples would be things like work integrated learning opportunities, or other ways to actually gain skills within the fields that they are studying would be, a way to actually bolster their human capital while they are temporary residents, so that they can become permanent residents, so that they can make long-term meaningful contributions. So, I'll leave it there. I think that there's this shift of Canada's immigration from permanent to temporary, brings up a myriad of different kind of concerns of exploitation, but also concerns that employers don't have an incentive to really improve labor market conditions, and just kind of are able to use labor supply in an unlimited way, and keep things the way they are. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Rupa. And I know there's a fair amount of interest in international students from our audience, so perhaps we'll return to that topic in a moment. But first, I'm noticing through the presentation and discussion, some of the questions that are coming in, that there's a lot of interest in this concept of essential workers, and what does that mean? And also just in, well, as you said at the outset, Martin, how we think about skills, and some ambiguity around the definition there. And so if we reflect of Canadian support for immigration is usually connected to the economic outcomes of immigrants, as often defined by their wages. So given these introductions of the concepts of essential workers and essential skills through the pandemic in particular, and the ambiguity perhaps around skills, is it time to redefine success? And what might a different definition therefore look like? Martin, why don't we start off with you and turn to Rupa?
Yeah, this question goes back to, I think, the objective. So if you want, how do we define success? Well, that obviously depends on what the objectives are in the first place. And I noticed in the Q&A also there was a question about where Canada ranks in terms of how progressive its policies are compared to other countries. And again, I would answer that question by simply saying, well, how do we define progressive in labor immigration policymaking? Is it about admitting large numbers? Is it about not discriminating between migrants, low and high skilled? Is it about integrating migrants well? Is it about treating them equally? Or is it about all of that? So I remember when I was a PhD student, I had the opportunity to work on a major study of reforming the kafil system in Kuwait, in the Gulf states. And I remember getting off the plane. I didn't know very much about Kuwait, but the first thing that I was told by the Ministry of Labor there is they welcomed me and said, we have a very progressive immigration policy because we admit millions of migrant workers, many more than Europe. And they sent home large numbers of remittances. And what we do to reduce global inequality is much more than many high-income countries do. So, of course, as we all know, migrant workers get treated terribly and suffer severe rights violations. But my point is that, is it time to rethink? As I mentioned before, I do think that COVID-19 raised the question of, is it possible to have more strategic policymaking that takes account of some of these challenges? But in my view, people will have different views on what the objectives should be, but there's very rarely explicit discussion about these issues. And it just sounds like such a basic point, but if you say, well, what are we trying to achieve? Even if we just have discussion about what does it mean to use migrant workers to benefit the economy, to what extent do we need to protect the employment of domestic workers, as we said, to what extent, is it a problem or not that migrants do not have fully equal rights in the welfare state? What kind of, so at the end of the day, it's about what kind of economy and society do we want to be? And I think different countries are having slightly different answers to these questions, but that I think ultimately will determine the objectives and then the evaluation of policies.
Thanks, Martin. Rupa.
In Canada, not just in Canada, I think globally, we use wages, right? I mean, how much do migrants earn? And how much do they earn relative to their native-born counterparts? That's kind of been the standard economic way of trying to determine the level of integration and whether someone is doing well. Of course, that's extremely limited and misses a lot, especially when you're talking, even if you just think about labor market shortages, if you simply look at wages, certain groups of very, very essential occupations don't earn a lot of money and yet contribute a lot to the society. So I think, you know, if we look at caregivers, for example, in Canada and the former living caregiver program, the current caregiver program, folks, you know, are very, very, very highly employed. So people who graduated from that program or completed that program and became permanent residents are more likely than native-born Canadians to be employed. But their earnings fall far below, you know, a lot of native-born workers, and certainly, you know, also a lot of immigrants as well. So the question becomes: are they then not integrating? Are they not contributing? And I would argue, yes, of course they are. And you know, in fact, that program has been really, in many ways, very successful in bringing in, you know, childcare and elder care workers who then transition to other forms of care work. So, I mean, there's a lot of, you know, problems with it as well in terms of folks getting kind of pigeonholed into occupations that they may not have wanted to stay in. But on the other hand, they've really, really contributed, particularly with COVID-19 and with the time of the pandemic. We've seen folks coming in through the LCP or the CP being on the front lines of taking care of, you know, people during COVID and during the pandemic. So, yeah, I think we have to be much more broad-minded in terms of what we mean when we say integration. In Canada, to me, it appears we're using numbers, 500,000, 2025, and earnings as our measures of how great we're doing. And I think that that's really, really troubling, because there are so many other indicators, such as you know, how well a group is integrated into the community, whether they're working, period, right? Whether they're contributing their labor to the economy, and many others, like psychological integration and linguistic integration, that are equally important, that, you know, need to be considered. So I think this is tied into this other question that I think has appeared in the question and answer, on how do we actually measure skill, right? Because the reason we use numbers and earnings is because our measurement of skill has been on formal credentialized educational degrees. And that's extremely problematic, because a lot of the fields which have the biggest labor gaps right now don't necessarily need those kinds of formalized credentials. So how do we measure skills in those highly gendered, care-based kinds of areas that really have not much to do with getting a degree? We haven't come up with a solution that's really, really workable and easy in a points-based system, which you can put down on paper, right? It's extremely challenging, but I think we need to talk about it and acknowledge that this is not the best way to let in or admit the people that we need going forward. Yeah.
Thanks, Rupa. Maybe just building off that last point of how to measure skills, there's also perhaps a consideration around how to recognize those skills in terms of those credentials. Both of you touched on credential recognition in your presentation, and I know there's a lot of questions from our audience linked to that as well. I'm kind of wondering if you have some thoughts of what Canada could learn from other countries, other jurisdictions, with respect to recognizing credentials, and any comments on kind of the federal role and the role of provinces and territories here in Canada. Martin, why don't we start off with you and then turn to Rupa?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. I'm not sure how much Canada will have to kind of learn from other countries in terms of the very important question of recognizing credentials. But maybe I can mention one thing in this regard, which is So one thing that was, so actually a lot of European countries, as you know, have been trying to learn from the Canadian experience in many ways, especially when it comes to designing points-based systems for higher skilled workers. And in European context, some of them would be given permanent residence, others temporary residence. But of course, the big question is, what criteria should be used for admitting migrants? And I know again in the UK, there was a highly skilled migrant program that was concerned in a way about who it would attract, and there was a system of sponsorship. So basically, it would be societies. So it would be an architectural society or a musical society or an artistic society that would basically sponsor, would provide some sort of vouching of the skills of the incoming person. Now, this might be a niche example, but in the UK there were a lot of problems about the rigid skills criteria to do with pay, education, and experience in a way, and some clearly very highly skilled people not meeting those criteria. And then exceptions had to be made, and those exceptions are usually made through the short occupation list. So ballet dancers, which were in great demand, did not usually, they're not highly paid. Many of them are not anyway. I mean, the top dancers are, but not many others. And education, they have a lot of experience, so they had different ways had to be found. And I can give you many different examples of clearly skilled and highly skilled occupations that did not pass the criteria. And as I said, one way in which policy tried to address this, at least partly, is to get some sort of endorsement mechanism, not from one person, but from a kind of a larger body that basically endorses the skills of this person. But I don't think it's a great answer to your question. So I don't think it's a tricky issue and a very important issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Rupa.
It's a tough one, right? Canada is seen as the leader in, or the, standout star in immigrant selection and integration. And I think what we talk about here in the Canadian context, in terms of as researchers and policymakers, is all of the problems that we still have. So, there are programs that you hear about in other jurisdictions which seem to have some benefit in terms of credential recognition, for example. But to be honest, I think, just the fact that we are talking about this, and we actually have a proactive immigration program and a goal of bringing in, highly skilled workers, makes us kind of leaders in the game. So I actually wouldn't say that we can learn a lot systematically from other jurisdictions. As Martin said, others are looking to us, but we also have to really be careful not to become complacent, to say, well, we're the leaders, we're doing so well. And a lot of the sort of government advertising around what we are and what we do as an immigrant society really promotes this story, which is, it's kind of this irony, right? Because the whole fact that we have this successful immigration program is why the public presumably is very positive towards immigration and the kind of like contributions that immigrants make. But on the other hand, there are some really conspicuous cracks in the system. And, I think I'm optimistic because we are speaking about it. We're talking about it, and we're trying to tackle some of these difficult issues. And policymakers seem to also be really cognizant of the fact that changes need to be made. In stark contrast to a place like the US, where nothing's changed since the 1990s in immigration policy. So in Canada, it's the exact opposite, of course, right? We have kind of changes at breakneck speed. Every other week, we have a new amendment or change or pilot program being announced, which has its own challenges. But I think the fact that we are on this, and it's something that's really on the radar, it's not nearly as politicized as it is in other jurisdictions, is something for optimism.
Thank you both. We've talked a little bit about selection and touched on integration and retention. I want to dig a little bit deeper into integration and retention issues. Obviously, globally, there are more people on the move than really ever before, it seems. Competition for talent is fierce, and there are very particular labor market needs in all countries of the world. What do you see as being really essential going forward to successfully integrate, and more than that, also retain immigrants, particularly in areas that might be more rural or remote? Why don't we start with Rupa and then turn to you, Martin? Rupa.
Sounds great. So I think that this, this rhetoric of immigration being a two-way street, or immigrant integration being a two-way street, is kind of, not really true currently. It's very much a one-way, disproportionately burden borne by the immigrant themselves in terms of integrating, and that needs to be refocused to becoming a bit more of a two-way street, I suppose. There are efforts in small pockets here and there to try and actually change employers' perceptions of immigrant workers and the kinds of skills they bring and how to actually recognize foreign skills, but this has not been done in a really widespread, systematic way. So that's one. Like I said earlier, I think there's this interesting paradox where if you look at any employer association survey, they love immigration. They want more and more immigrants, but of course they're talking about temporary residents. They're talking about mostly, international, temporary foreign workers to fill lower skilled jobs. I think we need to refocus the employer role in actually helping newcomers to succeed. Employers are kind of the first and essential line of integration that need to, really take this on as being a business issue. Because ultimately, if we see that 90% of the labor market growth going forward is going to be through immigration, then employers have a vested interest in really putting an investment into this. That goes along with a lot of other aspects of settlement services as well, that to me should start prior to migration. So pre-migration settlement services have now become more common. They have now kind of been growing, but because we have a two-step immigration system, a lot of people really struggle during their temporary resident days to try and acquire, the cultural knowledge and understanding, the language skills, the navigational skills, all of that, while having no support system at all. And that really needs to change. So we need more support systems, more government-funded settlement services for temporary residents, transparent paths to permanent residence, more availability of direct permanent resident status. So we, as we've shrunk the federal skilled workers program, we've almost become a de facto two-step immigration system. We're not quite there, but it's almost there. And so that also has implications. There's a lot of churn within the system where folks who are already brought in are the ones who are now going to be permanent residents. And so to bring in, fresh talent and fresh human capital, I think we need to also really prioritize permanent resident status. That's been the beacon of our immigration system, what everyone's been so proud of, and has actually worked to some extent with problems, but has worked to some extent. And so I think, those are the things I would say: get employers more involved, have more transparent pathways to permanent residence, have more labor rights for temporary residents, and ensure that, the permanent resident system is not abolished.
Thanks, Rupa. Martin, did you want to jump in on that?
Yes, I think I would agree that I think a key issue when it comes to long-term integration is access to rights, access to equal rights, and that includes access to permanent residence and citizenship. But I think when it comes, to long-term integration and retention, what matters I mean, the job is important, the pay is important, but what's also important are the other things to do with family life and to do with just general how welcoming a society it is, really. So I think people make decisions based on their employment situation, but also based on the school situation, based on housing issues, based on quality of life issues. Now, those issues cannot be changed very quickly and easily, but I think it's important that while of course it's true that labor migration is often driven by economic concerns, when it comes to long-term integration and especially when we think about families, those other things can be absolutely decisive. You know, if a migrant moves to a place and gets a perfect job at high pay, but if there are no suitable schools, so if their children are not fully integrated, then they're unlikely to stay. So I think it's important to again link with other public policy issues in this regard.
Excellent point. Rupa, you want a second jump in?
Yeah, and it's just in kind of in relation to a point that was made in the Q&A. It's very true that, you know, we're talking about the immigrant themselves and sort of their integration as a newcomer, but this is a much more long-term process, of course, right? So usually this is a multi-generational process where it takes several generations before newcomers tend to integrate. And in Canada, we've really shortened that to almost expect that an immigrant themselves is going to be able to become completely successful within a few years of reaching Canada. So the second generation's level of success is also extremely crucial. And what we've seen is the evidence so far shows that in general, the second generation in Canada is extremely successful in terms of level of education, in terms of employment. But that's also something that we need to really keep our eye on and needs more attention, because there are some intergroup differences in that level of success in the second generation that are starting to become more and more apparent. So I think we need to really, as Martin said, look at the integration of children, of school age and adolescent immigrants, so the 1.5 generation, those who come with their parents, and really look at how they're doing over time, and look at it in a disaggregated kind of way, because looking at it as a immigrant level, at the immigrant level, really hides a lot of disparities within there.
Indeed, I think we have time for maybe one more question. I did say I'd come back to international students, but I also want to ask a question that one of our audience have flagged, and that's we've been talking about economic immigration, but of course our streams of immigration are not necessarily watertight compartments. Indeed, refugees come to Canada and make contributions in the labor market. And we're actually really seeing that increasingly through kind of a labor mobility pathway pilot that IRCC has been undertaking, but also the family class. And so is there family members also contribute in the labor market or in schools? So is there a way to account for kind of the collective impact of those coming, not only that of the principal applicant, as we might say? And what does that mean for the way that we select immigrants in terms of high skill, low skill, essential skills? Is there a way that we can account for that kind of broader sense of our streams?
Shall I go?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think sometimes we think about, when we talk about labor migration, we think about migrants who've been admitted through labor migration programs, forgetting that, of course, many migrants admitted through other programs end up working as migrant workers. And I think when it comes, in my experience, when it comes to planning on labor immigration, it complicates issues quite considerably, in a sense that the question, is there a shortage of workers, obviously depends, well, who is here to work, who is available to work? And international students in many countries have a limited right to work during their studies. In some European countries, this is 20 hours a week. And I know hospitality sector, for example, absolutely relies on the work of these students. So in a way, so when then somebody says, well, we need migrant workers for hospitality, I think you have to look at the available labor supply, who's working in the sectors. How do we think about the sector using students quite intensively? I heard Rupert's kind of argument against that, and different people might have different views on this. Again, what is happening in many European countries where low-skilled labor immigration is quite restricted, family members end up doing a lot of these jobs, because somewhat paradoxically, again, this will not be news to this audience, under many work permit programs in Europe, the employment rights of the spouse are actually more generous than of the primary applicant. The primary applicant is typically restricted in employment to employer or a sector, where oftentimes the spouse can work in any sector. So that means that they also do jobs where they're needed. So I think that it's a very important point. We have to take account of asylum and refugees end up working, family members end up working, students in very large numbers. What does that mean for labor immigration policy? Because for every labor migrant you admit, there might be family members coming along. So it's important. It's much less clear in how you deal with that in policy making, but it needs to be considered when you ask the question, well, what is the available labor supply? We have citizens, we have migrants with different types of status, and to what extent do we want to change the composition of that labor supply, or even add to it through a labor immigration program?
Great framing questions. Rupa, would you like to jump in on that last question?
Sure. Well, I think when it comes to humanitarian grounds, migration on humanitarian grounds, I mean, we explicitly don't want to use human capital aspects to determine who should get it selected. But once they are here, I think we need more emphasis on the labor market contributions that they can make, because many, of course, who manage to become humanitarian, refugees, for example, have many skills. And so there are some programs and some nonprofits who have, tried to establish some bridging programs, et cetera, for refugees. But I think there's a lot more to be done on that. When you're talking about family members, family class, and also, secondary applicants or spousal applicants, I mean, that's huge. And the express entry system currently does have some recognition of that, but I think there's a lot more room for the family level unit and its contribution to, Canada's labor market, because this is also a very gendered issue. So we still find that in the vast majority of families, the man is the principal applicant and the woman is the spousal applicant. And, that really determines, often it's a very strategic decision. So it's done because that will, make the points that kind of maximize the number of points, but it also undermines the value of the skills that the spouse brings. And so I think we need to have, in the next generation of express entry, much more of an emphasis on kind of the family unit and the contributions that as a family unit that immigrants can make. So yeah, I think that's really, really important.
Oh, thank you so much, Rupa and Martin. This has just been a wonderful discussion. I think we're having a lot to take away. You've given us over the lunch hour tremendous food for thought, reflecting on labor market, on immigration streams, on essential skills, on different pathways. I'm sure the audience really appreciative of all of your comments and your perspective. And with that, I turn back to Naomi, who I see has joined us.
Thank you. Thank you, Marion, and thank you, Rupa and Martin. I was jumping out of my seat wanting to participate in this and didn't, but I really wish I'd had the opportunity to engage even more directly. I know our audience really appreciated both your moderating, Marion, which I think was terrific, and going through all those questions and keeping the conversation on point, and to Rupa and Martin for your very significant food for thought that you provided all of us. So thank you all. To the people who are watching, just so that you know, all the slides that were used will in fact be posted to the website. And I think as well, the video of this session will be posted to the website after the fact. So you can go back and think about some of these issues again and again. The next policy seminar in the series is going to be on the care economy, which we actually touched on today and have in previous sessions. It's clearly an area that is critically important for us going forward, particularly with our aging population. That session is going to be on Wednesday, November 9th, again at noon. If you haven't already registered for that session, all you have to do is go to the conference site of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and register for that session or for others. The speakers for that session on the care economy will be Laura Turquette, who is a policy advisor and deputy chief of research and data at UN Women, and Ido Pang, who is the Canada Research Chair in Global Public Policy and the Director of the Centre for Global Social Policy at U of T, University of Toronto, and a member of our and the session will be moderated by James Gennaro, who's the Director of Policy and Government Relations at the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence. So it's sure to be a really excellent one, and we hope to see you then. Before closing, I would just like to thank Employment and Social Development Canada and Marion's organization, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, for their support of this institute, which has allowed us to bring leading international and Canadian experts to this public forum. So thanks to everybody for coming today. Your questions were excellent, and hope to see you again on Wednesday. Happy afternoon to all.
Thank you.